Hey everyone, so in this video we're going to cover everything you need to know about how to beat the bookies using historical data and Betsniper Implied EV tool. Let's jump into it. So Implied EV refers to the concept of using historical data to calculate an implied probability of an event occurring. We can then convert this percentage to odds and compare this to the actual odds of the market. This is a bottoms-up approach to value betting where we are trying to quickly determine a fair price of a bet using historical data as the basis. If we can find betting odds that are greater than the implied odds, we may have a good betting opportunity. So you may be thinking like that seems a bit too easy. Is this really a profitable strategy? And you're definitely right to be skeptical. It is not that straightforward. Implied probabilities are just a really neat way to quickly evaluate thousands of bets at once and identify potentially good betting opportunities. Ultimately, a significant portion of any odd is going to draw from the historical data. And so in the right situations, it figures that if we can find odds that are significantly greater than those implied probabilities, it is always at the very least a good starting point. So let's take a look at some examples that I've shared recently of just times where I've found really good bets just based on using implied data as my sort of thesis. So this first bet was for Darcy Cameron 15 plus disposals. He had hit this in 27 out of the last 36 matches, which means 75% of the time, which we can convert to an odd of $1.33. There was $1.82 odds available, and so for me that was a good betting opportunity. Another example was Will Ashcroft 90 plus fantasy. He'd hit this at 10 in the last 14 matches, which would suggest 71% implied probability and odds of $1.41. And then again, odds of $1.82 for me was a good betting opportunity. And then the last example was Jeremy Cameron to get 14 plus disposals. This was using the tab promotion where you get one disposal. So he'd hit this 25 out of the last 31 times for 81% 81% implied probability or odds of $1.24, and I was able to get odds of $1.85. And so essentially I quickly used the implied EV tool to show me that bet and then was able to validate it and put the bet on. Unfortunately, it's not just as simple as betting whenever you see implied odds greater than the betting price. There's a bit more nuance to it, and that's what we'll kind of cover in this video. So we'll go over 5 things. First, a step-by-step on how to use the implied EV tool to find winning bets. Second, explain how you can find value with the implied EV tool. Third, give you a proven framework to help you make better betting decisions using the implied EV tool. 4, discuss which sports are best to beat with the implied EV. And 5th, share some actual strategies that myself and other Betsniper users have been implementing to actually make some money using this tool. So the first thing I want to make really clear about the implied EV tool and this analysis is it's purely an informational tool. These are not betting recommendations. What it does do is it quickly analyzes thousands of odds and player data and shows you opportunities that may present value. So let's take a look at the tool together and show you how it works. When you open the implied EV page, it will be sorted by the largest difference between the actual odds and the implied odds. By default, the number of games is set to 10, but you can change how many games are considered, and this will automatically update the implied odds calculation. As a general rule, the more data, the better, although there are some nuances that we will need to take into consideration that we can talk about later in the video. There's also an option where you can filter for bets that have a big price discrepancy compared to the average price of the bet in the market. So you can use this to increase that discrepancy, and the average price is shown here, and then the difference. So this is the difference between the odds and the average price. Additionally, you're also able to filter by sport, by bookies, by match, by market, and by odds. My personal preference and recommendation is that you just filter the page by a singular sport or for a singular match, because otherwise then it's too much information going on at once, and that way you can really focus your energy. So I think it's just good to also cover why does this actually give us an edge, or why do these bets exist. This is different to our popular products that we have with our positive EV and sure bets tool, but in order to find value with the implied EV tool, you need to do 2 things. One, do a bit of research to validate your findings, and two, also have a general understanding of what is happening in the sport, because it is easy to be tricked by historical data if you aren't aware of, what the news, pretty much. So ultimately, where the implied EV tool shines is finding value in the over-only markets. There are a lot of props that only get priced with the over-only market, and because they don't offer the under side of the market, often these prices can be extremely out of line with other bookmakers, and because each bookmaker is independently setting their prices, there are often times where you can find some really good value with these with their over-only markets, as opposed to markets where they offer the under price as well. Normally, the over-only markets are terrible value because bookmakers can put unlimited margin on them, but when we are able to quickly analyze thousands of markets at once, there are opportunities to spot where there are some mispricings. And so the key is just to know where those mispricings are, and the implied EV is just a great way to quickly spot those mispricings. Okay, so now we're going to go into discussing a bit about a framework that I've kind of put together to help me evaluate bets using the implied EV tool. The implied probability is a good baseline to help us evaluate bets. We then need to run the implied probability through some questions where we can adjust that price up or down based on the answers to these following questions. We've put together a 6-question framework that you should always consider before placing any bet using the implied EV tool. The questions can be split into 2 categories. One I call the foundation factors, and the second the calibration factors. So the foundation questions have a binary result in determining whether the historical data is illustrative in helping you figure out a fair price. So those 2 questions are, has the player changed teams recently, or has the player changed role? Then once you've passed these 2 questions and we have determined that this historical data can be used, the remaining 4 questions determine how to interpret and weigh this data. So I refer to these as the calibration questions, and these questions will help you adjust your understanding of the implied probability up or down based on the specific game conditions or statistical patterns. So the questions you need to ask yourself are, how volatile and variable is this stat? How big is the game span that you're analyzing? What are the odds of the underlying prop you're betting? And then what is the matchup? And now I'll go into breaking these down a bit further. So, has the player changed teams? If yes, then historical stats from the previous team become largely irrelevant. Different teams mean different systems, teammates, coaching style, roles, and all that sort of stuff that really make grabbing information from a past season not that helpful or illustrative. And ultimately, using data like this will make your analysis incorrect and give you a distorted baseline. I would even say using data from previous seasons, even if the player's on the same team, depending on the sport, but usually can be quite misleading, especially if there's massive changes to the roster, new coach, new strategies, and all that sort of stuff. Year to year, there are usually quite significant changes, even if you are on the same team. So just an example I've put up here is Peatling, who moved clubs this year, and yeah, his role last year is completely different to what he has at Adelaide now, and using that data to help you make decisions is not smart. The second foundational question is, has the player had the same role? And so this is actually a really important thing to know, because the player's role is going to have a large impact on their ability to generate stats, right? So the player's role may change, whether it's an opponent or a lineup change, someone's coming into the team, or someone's going out of the team, or maybe it's just a coach's decision changing a player week to week. And so why I say this is really important is because often you will see bets on the implied EV screen that will be suggested, but the only reason they're suggested is because there has been a role change. For instance, if a player has moved from the midfield to defense and are now going to average less disposals, the odds may have already adjusted for that, but the implied odds would not have, because it's not happened yet. And so you will see these big discrepancies between the odds and the implied odds. And so you just need to be aware of when that may happen to players, because obviously in that situation, you can't be validating your bet based on data that happened when they weren't playing that position. And so a good example of this from this season in AFL has been Colby McKercher. After the buys, round 11, he changed roles completely, moved to a half-back role, much friendlier role for disposals, and his disposals have taken a significant rise since then. But effectively using that data in the first 11 rounds of the season will just be useless, because he's in now a completely different role, so we can't consider that information. Now we're going to the calibration factors and questions. So the first one is how volatile and variable is the stat. This is a little complicated to understand, but I think it's really important if you are going to try and use this analysis in your betting. For any given bet you're making on any given player prop, you need to have an understanding of how that stat for the given player is distributed. So let's take an example of two basketball players who both average 6 assists. One gets between 5 to 7 assists every match, compared to another one who ranges between 2 and 12. So the first player we would say has low volatility, so predictable game-to-game outcomes, and low variance, tight clustering around the mean, while the second has high variance, which is a wide spread of outcomes, which makes each individual game a lot harder to predict. And so understanding the distribution of a stat helps you better understand how informative historical data can be, or how much data you require for historical data to be useful in giving you a fair price. High volatility stats like steals and blocks and three-pointers are inherently harder to predict from game to game. So if we are going to use historical data, we want a lot larger sample size. And then the stat that's both low variance and low volatility gives you much more confidence in using historical data as your baseline than a stat where the outcomes swing wildly, regardless of the player's underlying skill. So I put together this small framework which shows for some common betting props the volatility and variance. This isn't uniform for every player. Individual players have their own distributions and characteristics, but I think this kind of generally gives a good overview of what it would be like. So disposals in AFL are actually a really good sport to use historical data on because it is low volatility and low variance. But this does not mean you can't use historical data to find bets in these other props that have high volatility or high variance. It just means you need to be considerate of other factors, and we'll speak about those other factors coming up. So the next factor you want to consider is how big of a game span do you have to compare the data for. Generally speaking, the larger the game span, the better. Again, this only matters if all those aspects, if in that game span, the role, the team has stayed consistent. Because if that's not consistent, then it's not relevant. So the more you can go back, the better. But it's also something that you need to be aware of. If someone has had a role change and there's only a small amount of data you can use, then you actually don't want to use more data. You just want to use the data of that role change. And so this McKercher is a good example where if you notice he had a role change, after round 15, you kind of wouldn't, you'd only want to use that last 3 games to evaluate whether or not you might be able to find value. And so the implied probability of those last 3 games could just give you a better sense of where he's at in this new role. And if you were to find odds significantly greater than that, that could be a good betting opportunity. And I just put the little graphic from Sportsbet here as a bit of a comment on the fact that they give you the last 5 game information as if that's going to be helpful, particularly for a market that is highly volatile and medium variance. So, you need to have more data than that if you are seriously going to use historical data to help inform whether or not you're getting a good price. The next question you need to ask yourself or consider when you are using implied data is just what are the odds you're betting at. This again is a bit complicated, but the odds range fundamentally changes how you should evaluate implied data reliability. Higher odds mean you're betting on less frequent outcomes, which makes variance a much bigger factor in your analysis. So when betting on things that are less likely to happen, small sample variance becomes your biggest enemy. So let's consider a bet at $5 odds for an NBA player to score 4 threes as an example. So at $5 odds, you can convert that to an implied probability, which is 20%. And let's just say that we're reviewing the last 20 games of data and we can see the players hit this 4 times in the last 20 games, which again is 20%. So we see that the implied probability matches the odds. But that doesn't really tell us much because with such low hit rates, those 4 matches could have been statistical anomalies. They could have been against the easiest teams. They could have been in junk time. They could have been when players were out. And so it's really easy for you to think you're getting good value when you got higher odds, because when you use historical data, you need a lot more data to validate it. And so, yeah, it's just something that we need to consider. For higher odds, you need to have a deeper understanding of the past matches or have a much larger sample size. And then with lower odds, you don't necessarily need to have a larger sample size, because their event isn't as unlikely to happen. So it's this is where the volatility comes into it. On lower odds, it's usually a less volatile event compared to higher odds. And you can see all these calibration factors are kind of interlinked. And the last calibration factor is what is the matchup, or what has been the past matchups. So depending on the sport, the player, and the stat, matchups can be super important. In easy matchups, we can assume that historical, if we're using implied probability as our baseline, we can assume that the price should be lower because it's an easier matchup, which means they should hit that line more often. And then the same for harder matchups, we should adjust our price up, because we would assume all things held even in harder matchups, it's more unlikely they're gonna hit that implied probability. And then the other thing we need to consider here is, if we are using implied data, what have been the past matchups that we're using in that data? So particularly for smaller data sets, if we're evaluating, for instance, an AFL goal scoring prop, and we're looking at a player to kick 3+ goals, and in the last 10 games they've played the worst, the bottom teams a few times, that might skew the data to think that this is a good bet. So we just need to also be aware of what have the past matchups been as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of the framework and how you should evaluate implied EV bets. There are some other factors you want to consider in your thinking, but I think this covers the major ones. The other kind of key one that you should also kind of ask yourself is like weather conditions. If it is a sport where weather changes how games are played, you want to kind of factor that into your thinking, because if you're using implied data on days where the conditions were different, then it's not really that useful moving forward as well. So the key thing to understand here is that implied probabilities give you a good baseline. You then need to run the bet through this framework and determine how useful the implied data is for determining a fair price. The implied probability is just a good starting point, but this probability will always need to be adjusted up or down, or your confidence in this price will need to be adjusted up or down based on your answers to the calibration factors given the bet you're looking at. And I think that the bets you find you should always do a bit of research on them, or you need to be very familiar with the sport that you're betting on. And then every bet you analyze will have its own nuances, and the way the calibration factors interact with each other also are quite complicated. And so what I've tried to do is put together a database that shows you the impact of variance, volatility, and odd size on the sample size required in order to evaluate bets. And so we can see that if we have a low volatility and low variance with small odds, the predictability will be good even with a small sample size. On the other end, if we have high volatility and high variance and the odds are large or big, we require a large sample size, and even at that point the predictability will still be questionable. Ultimately, in most cases, a huge contribution of price is going to be implied data or historical data, and so the goal of this approach is to try and determine a fair price with reasonable confidence intervals, and then see if we can find odds that are significantly greater than that. And ultimately this manifests in two different ways. So one, you have large enough discrepancies to the implied price that we have enough margin for value, or two, we have a small discrepancy between the actual price and the implied price, but we have other factors in our favor, such as a favorable matchup, low odds, or favorable position change. So which sports are best for implied EV? Really, it can be used on any sport, but there are certain sports that have some benefits, and I'll kind of just run through some of those now. So AFL is by far one of the best to do it for. This is because AFL doesn't price up a lot of over-under markets, but they do price up a lot of prop markets with the over-only and this just often leads to some mispricings and some value opportunities. And most people who are successful with any AFL punting will use some form of historical data analysis to help them originate a price. This is the same for NRL, except bookmakers are not pricing up nearly as many prop markets as they do for the AFL. NBA is another really good sport for using the implied tool. This is because there's a lot more games that are happening and changes from game to game, which means lineup changes and potential for mispricing and potential for edges. Also, the modeling in NBA for betting agencies tend to be a lot stronger because most bookmakers offer over-under prices, which have a much smaller margin. But what does happen occasionally is they offer alternate lines around those over-under prices, but their modeling on the outlines aren't so good. So sometimes you can find value in the distributions, the right side of the distribution. So for instance, they might have priced the market at over 6.5 assists, but the alternate line for 7, for 8 assists, for 9 assists isn't quite right, and you can get some value there, particularly if you use the implied EV tool to spot where there might be some trends. NFL is another good sport for implied EV. The seasons are short, so you don't get a lot of historical data, but the matchups are also really important, so they can kind of have a huge impact on odds. So using the implied EV can be a great way to quickly spot some potential value opportunities. Last thing I want to cover is using some actual strategies and practical tips on how to use the tool to find some bets quickly. So the first one that I want to recommend, and is very obvious, is you just want to look at opportunities where the implied odds are significantly greater than the actual odds. So what you want to do is filter the odds by the implied stat difference column, and that way we have the biggest differentials at the top. And effectively, you want to go through each of these bets and run it through the framework to see whether or not this is a good bet to pursue. But starting with this massive difference, this gives you a big margin to work with. The next strategy is looking at bets where you've got implied odds greater than the actual odds, but then you've also got some large price difference on those markets as well. So you want to maybe filter the price difference and have this at like 15%. So then now we're looking at bets where we've got good historical stat difference, the difference between the odds and the implied odds. And then we've also got maybe some value just on the market, because the rest of the market is pricing this at 225 and we can get 261. And so this can just be another good parameter to run through to see if there's any value on top of the historical data giving you some value. The third strategy that I use is I will filter the page for lower odds and try and find some short price legs that are at value or are value to include in same game multis. Because with same game, and this is only if you have those promotions on those multis, you want to obviously be playing lower odds if you're trying to play a long profitable game. And what you want to try and do is avoid putting in bad value bets, because you will win your same game multis even if you put bad value bets in there, because you're taking $1.30 legs, $1.20 legs, or whatever. But where possible, you just want to make sure you're choosing an $1.20 leg that's as close to a true $1.20 as possible, as opposed to taking a bet at $1.20 where the true odds are $1.40. So it's still likely to win, but you will in the long run get screwed on value. So what I do on this page is I would probably filter this odds for maximum of 2, and then I want to look, and I'll put this price difference back down to 0, and then essentially I want to kind of use these odds as good odds to include in a potential same game multi. And then the last strategy is using the Betsniper Discord bot, which we have a market opening bot, and essentially this will tell you whenever new markets come online. And this is just a great way to quickly snipe prices, because when bookmakers release prices, that's usually where you can find the most value. And the implied EV will quickly show you where these value opportunities may exist. However, I will caution that if you do this, it can be quite risky for your account, because anyone seeing sniping prices as soon as they open is going to put you high on the radar for bookmakers. So that's a wrap. Hopefully that was helpful. The more you do this, the more you start to build intuition around numbers, and the better you understand matchups and stat volatility, the quicker you'll be able to see a price and know whether or not it's value. It is definitely a bit more advanced than some of our other tools that we have on Betsniper, but it can be an awesome way to beat the bookies, particularly if you enjoy the puzzle of figuring out a price and creating your own kind of estimates. If you have any questions or you want to get some coaching or a free strategy session, we are here to talk. You can book that with us whenever you want, and we can walk you through exactly how you can do this for yourself.